This is John Logan Martell of The Middle Ground, and I want to throw my 2 cents in on the issue of Zionism, Israel-Palestine conflict. No, it's not really complicated. Yes, it's basically, yes, it's the, and why every single issue like this is made out to be something incredibly complicated when it's not. And I can think of off the top of my head quite a few of these complicated issues that basically come down to one side, viz. The oppressors, have all the power, and the other side is left with no option but to fight back. All right? And there's going to be some people who are really going to dislike what I'm saying, because there always are with issues like this, but I don't care. If you have legitimate complaints, complain. Otherwise, just do what you always do and try to justify your point of view, however way you can. You can. Okay. Israel and its brutal ethnic cleansing and relocation of the Palestinians goes back 70 years, roughly. And that's when Israel was what was Israel. Before then, it was British oppression against the Palestinian people. They were kind of paving the way for the Israeli Zionist settlers to start moving in and taking over the brutality for them. The history of the Zionist movement to take over their historical homeland, despite the fact that that place has been an Islamic or Arabic country for literally thousands of years. Just ask any of the non-Zionist people who actually understand a little bit about geography and history, in a thing called the Ottoman Empire. Like, seriously, Israeli citizens have Ottoman passports, which is hilarious. They're claiming that this is the Jewish homeland, right? And they're using, completely unironically, they're using Ottoman passports, which was a Muslim empire, to make their case. And yet when a Palestinian shows that exact same passport, regardless of the fact that the only people there who actually have any ties to the Ottoman Empire are, in fact, the people of Palestine, the Zionists then totally unironically say, "You're not a human being, shut the fuck up, go back to your shithole, and wait for us to bomb you." So, yeah. And that's the problem when dealing with this kind of issue. It's that one side always takes that extremely hard, that kind of approach. You can give us any amount of proof, including the stuff I've seen with my own eyes, and I will throw stones at you. In the case of it, Zionists, quite literally, daring to speak anything resembling uncomfortable facts. I will declare you a racist, an anti-Semite, a Holocaust denier, yada, yada, yada. The classic, I've got no ground to stand on arguments, basically. Because if the only thing you can come up with is, but you're racist, but you're anti-Semitic, but you just hate, you get, these incredibly simplistic arguments, basically, then you clearly don't have enough information even for yourself to actually justify what you're saying. Because all you're doing is quoting something that somebody else told you, in your school of Zionistic Hitler Youth. So yes, and I just said Zionism and is the same thing as Nazi fascism, and it is. It's the exact same thing. It's a specific ethnic group of people saying that they have the right to wipe out another ethnic group of people. Oh, and by the way, we've got this completely bullshit prior claim on these people's land, which magically justifies our rights to murder them and make their lives as miserable as possible. Yeah, that's totally not what it says in Mein Kampf about the Jews. Just saying. That's just straight up fascism. No ifs, ands, or buts, right? And what happened when the fascists invaded, various countries at the start of World War II? Well, people shot back at them, right? They fought back. They retaliated, right? And it went on for about, 6 years, 40 million casualties later. Most of Europe had been reduced to rubble, that kind of deal. But the people who did that were heroes, right? People who did that were heroes. But here's what gets really great. Unless, of course, they were then then they became politically inconvenient or on part of the wrong ideology or whatever. So, for example, World War II could not have been won by the Allied powers. Or, well, it could have been, but it would have been much longer and it would have been far more likely that they simply would have that the Western Allies would have just given up out of sheer exhaustion. It's like in World War I, before the Americans showed up with their fresh influx of troops and whatnot, with right at the end of the war, I might add, both sides were at the breaking point. Both sides were at the point of exhaustion. Like they literally had beaten each other into near submission. And it was only sheer total stubbornness and an inability to just be like, okay, enough. But if the Americans hadn't come in when they did, and 6 months later the war was over, by the way, hadn't come in when they did, the war would have probably just petered out on its own and remained an uneasy ceasefire or something. But the point is that it wouldn't have been over anyways because both sides were completely exhausted. The Germans would have likely held on to the territory they had. And so, most of Belgium by that point, obviously would have been under their control, a not insignificant portion of northern France, among others. That's what would have happened. So there's a bit of context there, But because the Americans showed up with a fresh influx of troops and basically piss and vinegar, the opposite happened. The Germans and the Austrians got pushed all the way back. The war was declared over, and then the Versailles happened, and the rest, as they say, is history. But it just goes to show how easily they could have gone the other way, and maybe, just maybe, the world would look very different, and there would be large parts of Europe that would have a lot more German speakers in them, or at least a mix or whatever. The point is the demographics would certainly look different. Well, then World War II happened. And World War II was started by a bunch of basically sore losers who couldn't, from the German army, basically, who couldn't stand the fact that they lost the war. So these guys, they called themselves the National Socialist Party, made up this lie to justify their subsequent brutality and carnage they unleashed on the world. And specifically on some groups more than others, but they were pretty uncompromising in if you resisted them, they would shoot you. Like really was that simple for most people. Like if you were living in occupied France, for example, it didn't matter if you were a Jew. If you fought them, they would kill you. It didn't matter that your country didn't have a proper military anymore. It didn't matter that they owned everything and they regularly ran off with your livestock and took your and emptied your and deported your paintings and all this, stole your culture, all the rest of it, so some Nazi official could put it on their wall back home. None of that mattered. All that mattered was that your life was basically either keep your head down and try to survive, or fight. And if you fought, chances are you and people you cared about would get killed. So why the flying fuck should it be any different when people look at the Palestine-Israel conflict? In this case, just ignore the maps and just replace Palestinian resistance with the French resistance, or any of the other resistance in Nazi-occupied countries, for that matter. How is that any different? These are people who have been invaded, who have been brutally oppressed, who have seen their families starved and butchered for decade upon decade, and they've watched most of the rest of the world do absolutely nothing to stop it. In fact, they've watched the most powerful countries' military political lines up until fairly recently, that would be NATO, actively support them, their oppressors. Meanwhile, Israel tests out lots of fancy new gadgets for the U.S. Military and police. Fun fact. So, yeah, fun fact there. A lot of the stuff that your local police forces use to, let's say, for example, shoot unarmed Black Lives Matters protesters who are arguing much the same point that the Palestinians are, minus the rockets. But, the reason why people get out in the streets and protest in massive numbers is because they're given no other choice. It's no different with the Palestinians. There is literally no difference, including the brutal displays of unmitigated force used to suppress any form of resistance, be it one person, 10, or 100 who have made a stand, peaceful or whatever, and said, we're not going to put up with your crap anymore. There is no difference there. There is none. There is no difference. There is no difference between an IDF soldier mercilessly gunning down a random Palestinian for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or giving them a middle finger for, being an asshole to them for the last 70 years, than there is a racist U.S. state trooper shooting an unarmed protester at a Black Lives Matter rally. There is no difference. None. There is no difference. All right? It doesn't exist. There is no difference. The only difference is that Black Lives Matter haven't had to resort to rocket attacks yet. Who knows? If things keep going the way they are, maybe they'll end up, finally losing their patience after basically putting up with the same bullshit for 200 years. I mean, if you look at an even longer track record of behaving like that than Israel. Israel's been doing it for 70 years to the Palestinians. The U.S. has been doing it pretty much from the start. So, yeah. And your taxpayers' money goes to help both. Your taxpayers' money funds those brutal, corrupt police departments, which act more like a military occupation force in a foreign country than they do any kind of peacekeepers. I mean, I'm pretty sure if you ask most soldiers who've been to, Afghanistan, for example, or just most soldiers in general who have been deployed to a place that's not their home, you'll find out that most of them didn't exactly go out of their way to piss off random locals by shooting them for no reason, because most of these people have something in common. They want to come back home, right? And that means not needlessly aggravating the locals and giving them a perfectly good reason to want to kill you back, right? Like that guy, that war criminal that Trump gave a blank check to. The guy who was turned in by his entire platoon. That guy. That kind of guy. Or the guy who just who thought it was fun to choke a black dude in broad daylight, and take his time about it. That dude. Chauvin. So what you have are two countries. One is definitely supporting and in fact vital to the survival of the other, but still basically the same story. Brutally oppressing people for basically no other reason than these people are like, dude, we want to be treated like human beings. Well, bang. That's their response every single time. Or they knock or they'll suddenly find themselves evicted, which in Zionist parlance, and IDF parlance means the home that like 30, 40, how many people are living in it, and it's full of Palestinians were living in. It means that if they refuse to leave for literally no reason, they're just told to leave one day, if they refuse to leave, soldiers are sent in there and they're pulled out of their beds. Their belongings are either confiscated or thrown out with them. And if even that's not enough to get them to go, then they're shot, pepper sprayed, rubber bulleted, flashbanged. I know a guy a UN observer who's been to Palestine. Guy's Jewish, by the way, who's been to Palestine and has seen these things with his own eyes. He says this is the way they occupy an area that has Palestinians in it that refuse to leave. They send in rabid mobs of Zionist settlers, like basically Wild West stuff, stuff, who are backed by an equally fun mob of armed soldiers. And if these people don't just run for the hills right then and there, are subjected to everything from rocks, flashbangs, all sorts of less lethal riot control weaponry. And if even that's not enough to get rid of them, which sometimes it isn't, then they're just probably likely to be straight up murdered. If the rest of it wasn't enough to convince them to leave. That is every single day in Israeli-occupied Palestinian territory. That is every fucking day of your life, fearing that some random group of settlers that just got a authorization from the government is just going to show up at your front door and rip you out of your home, often with lethal results. And then they'll bulldoze that home. Yeah. Fun for the whole family. And this is an entire country whose sole purpose is fanatically devoted to removing the people who've been living there for thousands of years, way before these guys have any claim, And the Bible is not an historical document. It doesn't work that way, okay? I'm sure a lot of people aren't going to like me saying that, but the Bible was not written by people who actually studied history. It was written by people who wanted to tell a story. And I'm not going to lie, there's some good stuff in there, but there's also a lot of pretty horrific stuff in the Bible. There's a lot of, especially in the earlier chapters, you get a lot of, God's a pretty genocidal guy kind of stuff. Sending angels to wipe out entire armies of people, pretty ones, or entire cities, or even the Jews or Hebrews on many occasions are fulfilling some commandment or other. That happens a few times. And then there was that one time involving a flood where they literally wiped out the entire planet, except for like a few people. So, yeah. The far-right Zionists, Christian Zionists who support the ones in Palestine, support the ones in the angry Israelites, they're the kind of people who love that part of the Bibles. The part where God sends an angel, which is basically the equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction, to just wipe out people because he had a bad day, woke up on the wrong side of the bed, and declared that that because it's God, fuck you. That's what a large chunk of, that's what a pretty big chunks of the Bible basically come down to. I'm God. You pissed me off. I woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Angel of mass destruction. Go and kill a bunch of people. And this is the kind of insanity that those people, the Zionists specifically, both the Jewish and the Christian variety, use to justify their claims on the Jewish ancestral homeland. It's not the freaking Jewish ancestral homeland, especially if they weren't even living there for hundreds of years, maybe a few of them. But the overwhelming majority of the population was, and until fairly recently, because they were forcibly deported, what still remained, unsurprisingly, Palestinians. Duh. Just look at a map. One that wasn't written before, one that was written before Israel, not after. It might say Palestine there, and there's going to be no bit where it says Israel. Maps are funny that way. They're rewritten for convenience, like so many other things. And in the middle of all this pandemic, the lockdowns, we have got a country whose sole purpose in existence is to destroy lives. That's it. That's their thing. And then say that it's complicated. No, it really is not complicated. You make their lives as miserable as possible. You kill them. You starve them. You subject them to horrible cruelty, year after year, decade after decade, and most of the world just watches and sees and does nothing, or actively supports it. I mean, let's be straightforward here. Israel would not have lasted 5 seconds without the support of NATO. And really, that's the thing. Israel is nothing more than essentially a mercenary nation that serves as basically a giant airfield for U.S. foreign policy. To U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, that's what Israel is basically. It is a weaponized population full of hatred and vitriol that is also very conveniently completely dependent upon their support, especially the military variety, to keep other countries who would be like, no, you can't just come to this place and then say you own it and start killing people, and knocking down their, you can't do that. Other countries might decide that, that's not cool. You can't do that. That's criminal, to imprison an entire, a lot of people, and then bomb their cities and make sure that they can't prepare them, and make sure that they can't get medicine, and make sure that they can barely feed themselves, and make sure that they have no future, and make sure that the only response they have left is violence. And make sure especially that all the peaceful methods of resistance are ignored by the mass media. because the mass media is full of, but let's be realistic here, is full of cowards who are far more interested in looking the other way than being declared anti-Semitic or racist. You know, it's not racist if it's the truth. It's only racist when it's hateful bullshit. Well, anybody who says that Zionists are hateful and racist, that's the facts, Jack. And there's a pretty recent video on YouTube that shows a very brave reporter interviewing the common person, the random people in the streets of Israel, and they say the most hateful stuff just completely casually. You know, I believe one of them went all the way to saying we should kill the children too because they'll just end up taking up arms against us. And he said it with no, like, it was just a normal. This is just, for God's sake. He says it like that. This is just a normal thing that you say on camera for the whole world to hear, because for them it is. These people are brainwashed, exactly like the Hitler Youth were. These people have been brainwashed from cradle to the grave. That's how Zionist and any other mentality like that works. You need to start young to build up that kind of hatred. And that's exactly what they've been doing for 70 years. And it's no different with groups like the KKK, you know, the far-right militia groups. You know, you've got all peppered all over the place in the United States. And I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but let's be realistic here. There's a certain group in Canada who loves to play victim while holding a huge, massive amount of political power over everybody else's heads. And, yeah. I think most people in Canada will know exactly who I'm referring to when I talk about that particular group. And their sole claim to being angry, which is equally as fictitious not as fictitious as the one in Israel, is equally absurd, is my language. You know, well, fine. You know, I don't care if you don't want to learn a language. That's neither here nor there to me. Just don't make it everybody else's business to know how much you hate everybody who doesn't speak. You want everybody to be assimilated by your language, and you know, and have stuff like language police. Really? And in most of these cases, with groups like this, you will find more often than not, especially when it comes to like the nationalistic types, the right-wing nationalist types, the hardcore ones, the ones that absolutely refuse to see any kind of, you know, context for their actions or irony, especially in the case of Israel, you know, that they're literally doing exactly what the Nazis did to them, you know. Like, these kind of groups all tend to have one thing in common. A bullshit background origin story. The Nazis had the betrayal myth, you know, which was basically, we don't want to admit that we lost World War I fair and square. So we're going to make up this batshit backstory about a massive Jewish international conspiracy and Romani and Russians and Bolsheviks, and basically we're going to just conveniently expand this list for political reasons at later dates. But the point is that we're going to have these certain groups right off the bat, you know, who need to be dealt with because they're part of this massive conspiracy of aliens, you know, who seek to harm the fatherland. Yada, yada, yada. You know, All fascist movements need that kind of stab in the back myth that justifies their actions by saying, "Oh, we were the victims, and now we're just getting our due." That's fascism, basically. If you boil it down to a very simplistic definition of what fascism is, it's basically a group that makes up a mythical backstory, usually one involving a ludicrously blown out of proportion, if not entirely made up, pseudo betrayal, which is exactly what the actual original Nazis used, saying that they were stabbed in the back by the civilian government, among others. And the civilian government rapidly became the Jewish conspiracy, and then it just kept snowballing from there. It went from Jewish conspiracy to Romanis, and basically anybody who they would could become a convenient political enemy. And so basically they could be like, see, ignore all the things around you, hate those guys over there, direct that anger somewhere that we want to be at. People, keep your heads down, shut up, and behave, or you'll end up on that list that we've got of people who betrayed us way back when. You also find something that all these kind of groups tend to have in common. They tend to have a few problems with their history books. Like, I'm pretty sure if you checked a Nazi history book, assuming you could even find one, versus, for example, literally anybody else's version of those events, you would find in every single case, the two descriptions would clash in every single way logically possible, because fascism is a denial of logic. It's saying, this didn't happen. Our version is the only one that happened, because we need it to have happened to justify what we're doing. Okay? So, Zionism is no different. They have this mythological claim that doesn't exist, certainly not in any current format that would matter, and certainly no legal format that would matter, to a specific mythical homeland of their people. I mean, it doesn't matter that most of their people only showed up there after, like literally 70 years ago. They started moving in there about a few decades before that. Actually, right after World War I is when the Zionist movement really started, really got off its feet. And a lot of them were actually the first wave of Zionist immigrants were running away from Tsarist pogroms in Russia. Pre-World War I Russia, all right? For all you guys who love to say that Russia is evil. I'm not giving you any, that's not free ammunition to use against Russia. It happened. It's just a thing that happened. Yes, there were pogroms, but literally every fucking country had pogroms, almost without exception. They all did. They also all did slavery and all the rest of that fun stuff. This is stuff that almost everybody did. Everybody had that. Back then, that was just the way things worked. And for one reason or another, the Hebrews/Jews tended to end up on the wrong end of it. But then again, so did the Romani, and basically any other group that was deemed by your local government to be inconvenient by its presence. So we're going to make their life as difficult as possible. Look at England. Those when it comes to internalizing nationalistic hatred, that whole place is just chock full of people who secretly hate each other. Just ask the Welsh what they think about or the Scots. You don't even need to ask them. They'll just, or the Irish, or more specifically the Catholic Irish, that sort of thing. What they think about the English, for example. You'll get kind of the same deal. And in every single one of those cases, the British were asserting their right to rule because they were simply superior to those people. So yeah, a bit more straightforward than we've got the divine right. We've got a divine mandate to murder all your people and take over everything. At least in the case of the British Empire, there was some practical reasoning behind, like, yeah, we want your land, we want your land, we want your resources, and and all your people, all you filthy little peasants are going to shut up, or you're going to get thrown in a paddy wagon. I mean, not that it was much better for your British peasants, but the point remains. That's the way it worked. That's the way empires work by definition. And the United States of America is an empire. It expands. It conducts unjustified wars on people it has no grievance with because it wants their stuff. And one of those peoples that they happen to have chosen as a very convenient ally would be the Zionist Israeli state, because it's really easy to control people who are completely dependent upon your support to maintain their bullshit. Like, how long realistically do you think Zionism, or more specifically Israel as an entity, would last if the United States just one day was like, you know what? These guys are just too much trouble at this point. Let's dump them. Wash our hands of them before it blows up in our face. I mean, it already has blown up in their face, but, let's just say theoretically the United States was actually smart for once. And had a president that wasn't just, all about starting wars, looking for non-existent weapons of mass destruction, stealing this country's oil or that country's oil, fucking with Russia, fucking with China, and just generally making the lives of people in the Middle East that much more difficult for fun, or carpet bombing a certain country called, or carpet bombing certain countries like Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. Because those people want to no longer be under colonial rule after literally hundreds of years of various colonial rulers. France was the last, but they were by no means the first, not even close. It was so yeah. Zionism is fascism. It really is that simple. It is the justified annihilation of a people based on a bunch of batshit claims to a mythical past that you will never find in a single legitimate history book. And these people are doing the exact same thing to the Palestinians that the Nazis did to them. And that, well, let's be realistic here, that a lot of people did to them over centuries. Point is, it wasn't just the Nazis. There was centuries of it. Does that make it all right to then, the moment you get the support that you want, to then immediately go around and instead of, I mean, if I was a people that had been persecuted for centuries, mostly because I was convenient, and subjected to pogroms and then the Nazis and all that bullshit, and I was one of the people who then was like, hey, this place this opened up for us. We get an actual homeland where we can call the shots, not have to worry about somebody shotting us for once, or throwing us out because they don't find us because we're no longer convenient, or blaming us for all sorts of stuff that has nothing to do with us because we're the only people who are literate, that kind of thing. That's the whole Jewish banker conspiracy there. That's where that comes from, because more often not, the Jews were the only people were the best. Well, usually the Jews in any given community were like the best educated people there. They reading, writing, and arithmetic stuff. So they did those kind of jobs, that you needed an education for. For example, writing letters, banking, that, lending, that sort of stuff. You got to make a living. Well, that's how they made their living. But because it was mostly the Jews doing this, because this education quality-wise wasn't really that good back then, then it made it also very easy to blame them when bad times happened. Like, for example, disease starts sweeping through the country. Don't blame the idiots who failed to close the borders, for example. No, you got this convenient outsider group. Blame them. And that's what it came down to. It's always the same story. It's politically expedient to have a group that's easy to blame for all your problems, especially when you made them yourself. And by problems that you've made yourself, I'm also talking, of course, of neoliberal ideology. Take the state of Canada right now, for example. Our whole country is basically falling apart because the libs have determined in all their wisdom that science has no place, science and logic have no place in sound government. And the mainstream media is too busy selling out to do their job, which is tell the damn truth for once in a while. And be a check and balance on power. United States, the same story. Their mainstream media is almost entirely and utterly corrupt. They don't do what they do because it's their job to report the truth. They do what they do because they're given a giant paycheck. And anybody who doesn't do what they're told to do finds out very quickly that they won't have a job the next day. And they get viciously attacked by political opponents, and called all sorts of wonderful stuff by people who have no fucking clue what the hell they're talking about. But that's the life of a journalist. A journalist who screams foul when journalists sign up for that sort of thing. If you're going to be a journalist, you better expect to be under fire for having unpopular opinions or even worse, actual facts about powerful people or just thin-skinned groups. So, yeah. And it's the same thing with any group that has too much power. What do they always do? Instead of actually providing any kind of evidence that refutes what you're saying about them, especially when you've got your own evidence that shows very clearly that, yeah, I'm not making this up. Why would I? I've got the pictures and testimonies and everything. I don't have to make this up. Just read the damn article and make up your own mind. So a journalist who cries foul for being treated badly by people who don't like what they publish is about as funny as somebody who signed up into the military and then gets shot at and then says what I signed up for. Well, yeah, it's pretty kind of self-explanatory. You're going to get yourself into these kinds of potentially dangerous situations, if you do certain lines of work. So being a coward and being a journalist don't go hand. Don't You got to have serious guts to be a proper journalist. There's no ifs, and, or about it, because you're going to piss off powerful people if you do your job properly. It's just guaranteed. Or at the very least, you're going to piss off people who simply aren't afraid to be very nasty and or even violent because they don't like something you published. I'm not necessarily talking about, the big bad government, although they're certainly one of the more likely offenders in this case. I'm talking about, for example, fringe groups. For example, like if you published an article, for example, that says Scientologists are a bunch of batshit crazy cultists, and when those batshit crazy cultists decides that they don't like you anymore, and that you need to be, and that it's their duty to show you why their ideology is superior by giving you threats and hating you on social media, and then when that doesn't work, basically just doing everything you possibly can to ruin your life. And if they happen to run into you in the street, then assaulting you. That unfortunately comes very much with the territory of proper journalism. That's just part of the job, especially when because when you challenge people's beliefs, when you start poking holes in the lies that they've constructed around themselves to justify certain actions that they take, when you threaten to deconstruct their reality and be like, your point of view is interesting, but the facts say that you're full of crap. The reaction is usually the same. If people react as if you threaten their lives, because you threaten the reality they've constructed around themselves to justify the stuff that they do. That's whether it be an extreme nationalist, racist ideology, or whether it be some tin hat wearing cult, or whether it be some politician's dirty laundry you found out about. It's the same difference. People don't like having their bubbles popped, And in Israel, you have got a lot of people who are completely dependent upon this mythology they've been programmed with to sustain their completely false belief in their God-given homeland. Now, if the Zionists could somehow, wake up one day or be deprogrammed, very much like a lot of the Nazi people who had been under Nazi occupation, had to be denazified, that would be great. It would be great if something like that could happen after all the decades of. But Israel is an extremely well-armed and very violent state with an extremely violent ideology, and they have proven that they are more than willing and capable of violently attacking and destroying anybody. Ideology. Because unlike black people, who, as some assholes say, like to pull the race card, well, there's a guy in a comment section on a video of racism in the U.S. military, and he put it this way: people say that we pull a race card, and I say, who the hell put the race card in the damn deck to begin with? Who made race an issue in the very first place? You can't have it both ways. You can't do racist things to them, and then when they complain about it, say, oh, you're just pulling a race card. Same thing with Zionist Jews. You can't say, you can't do horrible, bloody things in the name of your superior genetics and your divine rights to be horrible to these people that already live there and have a much better product claim than you ever will. And, and then when somebody justifiably points out that what you're doing is not only horrible just generally, but, completely hypocritical, because that's exactly what they did to you, wait, and then you come over here and then you start fucking these people's lives up, you know, completely unironically. And I'm going to give you a hypothetical here. If I was part of an oppressed group, who've been treated like shit pretty regularly throughout history, and somebody just one day was like, hey, we're being given a homeland, place we can call our own, where we will be the ones making the rules. And all we have to do, basically, is not do what other people did to us for hundreds of years. I would be like, well, that's awesome. It kind of sucks that it's gotten to the point where we have to move literally to this place, but, it certainly beats the alternative of being persecuted simply for being not one of them everywhere you go. I would go to that country, this country whose name I will not name because it does not exist nor will ever exist. And it is fictitious. And here are things I would not do. I would not, firstly, go out of my way to piss off the locals in every way possible by making their life a living hell. I would not go out of my way to then call anybody who calls me out of my bullshit, well, racist, that kind of general, I don't have a better idea. I don't have a better grounding, and I don't need one. I'm just right and you're wrong kind of, stuff. And then when my inevitable comeuppance came in the form of a rocket, landing on top of me one day because I had been part of this group, that made these people's lives hell for 70 plus years, I would then not be like, I didn't sign up for this. This is not fair. I have every right to be here. They're the ones who are wrong. I wouldn't do any of those things. Because this country wouldn't exist, as I stated. Therefore, I wouldn't be there in the first place to do these things. And if this country did exist, which it would not, I would try to get along with the people there as much as possible. The people who were already there, who had been there for centuries, maybe thousands of years, because I'm not that kind of person. I might be the only person in that entire community who saw it that way. But fun fact, because I studied this issue a lot. The original Jewish settlers who came to Palestine had no problems with the locals. None. In fact, they were like what I said. They just minded their own business and and lived their lives. Unfortunately, sooner or later, once word started getting around that, hey, this place has been given to you by, this place has basically been given to you in a hot platter to do what you want with, and that includes, completely destroying the lives of people who've been living there for thousands of years, minding their own damn business. Well, you can. But the first wave or two of Jewish settlers who went to what would become Israel, they weren't like that. At least not for the most part. Like any group, there's always going to be some jackass who wants to make everybody else's life miserable, But it's not necessarily a race thing. It's just that they're a horrible person thing, But those were pretty small groups of people, the first, second wave. But then they got flooded out by a much more militant group, the Zionists. And that's when the Israel that we all love got really started. So, yeah. And the land that they settled, that they bought, I might add, it wasn't just given to them. Like they bought it. They bought it using fundraising campaigns. It was bought from absentee landlords who literally never spent any time there and couldn't give a damn about the fact that they were handing over this land that people already lived on, thank you very much, to people that up until that point hadn't even likely seen the place with their own eyes. And we're just going to start flooding there and start, well, doing what they've been doing for the following 70 years. And as much as it may surprise people to hear this, the Ottoman Empire, which, yes, could be a vicious place, but it was an empire. Empires tend to be pretty vicious. No different than any other. It didn't have any. The Ottoman Empire didn't have any problems specifically with Jews or even Christians most of the time. I mean, obviously they had their issues, especially over whose version of the one God was the bestest. Whose daddy was best. But for the most part, for the average Joe, the average person in the street usually doesn't care about that kind of bullshit, unless they've been whipped up into a frenzy and into a mob mentality. But you'll find very few people, especially back in the day when living was a lot harder, who had the time or the energy to waste, murdering or just being a jerk for literally no reason, because they just didn't have the time or energy to waste. When your life is much harder, it involves a hell of a lot more manual labor, and you don't have the wonders of the internet or all the rest of it to have screaming matches at people who live all the way across the world on an issue you're completely uneducated on. Point is, things have changed a lot since the Ottoman Empire. A lot. And the Ottoman Empire, it was an empire. Yes, it could be bloody brutal. There's no denying that. The Armenian genocide is a classic example. And even now, the Turks still refuse to admit that that's a thing. And they're also a member of NATO. So, and if for anybody who's listened and watched this far, one, I appreciate it. Unless you're just writing horrible things in the comment section, then I don't. And two, I was about to say something really good. What was it? In my head. So yeah. In the end, no, it's not complicated. Zionism is an evil, hateful system that exists for the sole purpose of propping up a fictitious history, a fictitious origin story. If you want those, they don't involve all sorts of doing horrible things to other people, go read a comic book or fantasy novel. That's what escapism is. Don't take it out on millions of people. Go read Lord of the Rings or something. Get a bloody hobby. If you need to blow off some extra steam, go play some FPSs or join a video game club or, do some outdoor sports. Point is, there are more constructive ways to take out some pent-up steam, than forming a national cult. Oh, yeah, right. I just remembered. Right. The thing I was going to say. Yeah, so NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, that the United States is so proudly and smugly the head of, and which is fully, unfortunately, participated in by Canada, the United Kingdom, and France, and Australia, which is very ironic because Australia was itself an ex-colony of the British Empire. But irony doesn't seem to matter to a lot of people these days. There are a frighteningly large number of nations that are part of NATO that have a appalling human rights record. And the vast majority of those places didn't even exist 100 years ago. And the reason why they've got such appalling human rights records is because the United States and its subsidiary members have a pretty solid history of replacing progressive governments that refuse to play ball with them with corrupt, violent, nationalistic right-wing governments. And their favorite variety of corrupt dictatorship seems to be of the decidedly fascistic and because God says we have the right variety. Like, for example, Turkey is a classic example. I mentioned those Armenian genocides. You've got Israel. You've got the Japanese. Let's not forget that lot. Yeah, I mean, they're one of 2 countries in the world that has completely, utterly denied having committed any kind of war crimes or crimes against humanity. Especially when literally everybody else knows that they did it. And those 2 countries are, of course, part of Team Good Guy, NATO. And of course, in Israel, they're proud of the things they do. They just don't consider it a crime. They'll tell anyone, yeah, kill them all. So I hope that gives people some food for thought and some context into just how messed up the whole situation is. And this is John Martello of the Middle Ground, signing out.